I slowly opened the new record I just got, my first ever jazz album, Miles Davis's The Man with the Horn. I never could have guessed what would happen once the needle of my record player touched that vinyl for the first time. It changed my life. Hello, my name is John Beckenhauer. I'm a student in public speaking under Guy Smith, presenting today about the history of jazz in America. I'm here to inform you about that exact history of jazz in our country. I've been a musician for many years, for most of my life, honestly, in a few different ways. And through that musical pursuit, I became an avid jazz fan. And being a fan of jazz led me to do extensive research into its culture, into its history, into its musical technicality. Next slide, please. Today, we'll be going over the roots of jazz and the inspiration that it draws from, the people and places that are important to jazz and prominent in the history of jazz, and then some of the impact and evolution, the changes that jazz has the changes that have happened to jazz over the years. Next slide, please. The record starts to spin, and my mind can't help but wonder and wander about what it is I'm hearing. Jazz has a history as rich as its sound. Encyclopedia Britannica believes that it sources a lot of its sound from the African tribal drums and polyrhythms of African tribal drums, as well as European harmonies and instruments. The improvisational factor also draws from African tribal music. According to the National Museum of American History, there's a lot of improv and a lot of polyrhythm that happens in jazz music. And jazz music, which started in the early 20th, late 19th century in New Orleans, uses these elements in many different ways by using different instruments, highlighting different beats, and adding emphasis in different spots to keep the listener kind of on their toes and keep it orally and sonically interesting. Jazz comes from ragtime and blues music, which came from the spirituals of the slave times. So jazz has a strong connection to slavery and is inherently black music. New Orleans is the birthplace of jazz, and the New Orleans Historical talks about how on Sundays, slaves would be able to congregate in a special place called Congo Square, which we'll talk more about later. But they'd be able to congregate there and listen to music, play music, perform, dance, have fun with each other, and enjoy each other's company. Which is really, really sacred and was unheard of at the time for slaves to have a day off where they could come together and party like that. In the 1920s and 30s is the jazz age, when jazz really boomed and started to spread like wildfire. It spread out of New Orleans, of course, and with that, there was a lot of white musicians that were performing jazz. Honestly, it became almost more common for jazz records to be white than not. In fact, the very first jazz record ever released, jazz recording, I should say, ever released, was by the Dixieland Jass Group, Jass, J-A-S-S, according to the Smithsonian. And according to U.B. Blake, one of the fathers of jazz, E-U-B-I-E Blake, jazz music which is actually jazz music, it didn't become jazz until Broadway started using elements of jazz, J-A-S-S, in their shows and their style, and they kind of changed the spelling to make it more jazzy. But anyways, jazz used to be jazz. And so now that we know a bit about the roots, let's look at the people and places and how these roots came into play and allow these people to branch out and explore jazz and create jazz themselves. The record's still spinning, and I can't help but just be absolutely gobsmacked by what I'm hearing. The man and his horn blast through my speakers and hit me square between the eyes, sending a shock through my body akin to the shockwave felt across the country as jazz rose in popularity. Next slide. Next slide. I would like to start with Duke Ellington, Sir Duke, truly mostly believed to be the father of jazz. He was born in April of 1899 in Washington, D.C., and according to the Songwriters Hall of Fame. He had more than a 50-year career traveling the world and sharing jazz with the world. He formed and led multiple bands. Two of the most popular are the Washingtonians, out of Washington, D.C., and then Duke Ellington and his orchestra, which was his big band group, which is a type of jazz big band where there'd be tons of musicians led by a specific person. Regardless, he was one of the most prominent figures in jazz, and after World War II, when big band music was kind of dying down, he took it upon himself to pay his orchestra to keep them going, to keep the music going, and use the royalties from his composition in order to pay them and keep the music alive, which is really something. Next slide. Louis Armstrong was born August of 1901 in New Orleans, and of course we all know Louis Armstrong, What a Wonderful World, one of the most legendary musicians of all time. But he had a very rough and dangerous childhood. He only obtained a fifth grade education before going into work, and with the money from work he purchased his first cornet. A cornet is like a trumpet, a little bit smaller. He was arrested and actually taken to a boys' home, a home for black boys at the time. And that was where he truly learned to play the cornet and became a musician. At 21, he joined King Oliver, another figurehead of jazz in Chicago, and they played music together until his wife, Louis Armstrong's wife, encouraged him to try to start a career in New York. That didn't exactly pan out, so he went back to Chicago, and that's where Louis Armstrong and his 5, as well as Louis Armstrong and his 7, really hit their stride and created some of the most influential and talked about pieces of jazz in jazz history. Next slide. The final person I'll talk about is Ella Fitzgerald. Born in August 1917 in Yonkers, New York, she was dubbed the First Lady of Song and the Queen of Jazz for a reason. She had a very, very rough childhood. She lost her sister, who she was dearly close to at a young age, and in that turmoil made some decisions that led to her getting arrested. She got arrested and was heavily abused by the staff that were tasked with taking care of her. She escaped the institution that she was being held at 15 and was now alone during the Great Depression. She somehow made it out, and sure enough, one night her ticket was drawn to perform an amateur night at the Apollo Theater. She was planning on dancing, but instead she sang because the act before her were such great dancers and she didn't want to be upstaged. She was met with hesitance, but of course, Ella being Ella, knocked the roof off that place, and she actually received an encore, which she happily obliged to give, and from that point on was launched into stardom as one of the greatest voices in American history. Thank you to Ella's biographical site for that information. Next slide. Now we're going to talk about some places that are prominent in jazz music. So New Orleans and Congo Square, the first two places we'll talk about. This is the birthplace of jazz. It's the melting pot of many cultures and sounds from all over the world. They all came together, and that's really how jazz was started. Louis Armstrong, Jelly Roll Martin, Wynton, and Ellis Marcelli are just a few musicians that come from New Orleans, but according to the city's official website, there is actually a park titled the Musical Legends Park, dedicated to all the musical legends that have come out of New Orleans. So that was just to name a few. Congo Square was an official slave site, was established as an official slave site in 1817, 50 years before slavery was abolished. Congo Square is where the slaves would gather on Sunday and play their music together and enjoy each other's company and just turn up. So they listened to this music together in Congo Square, and this is where the true soul of jazz is found. The true connection to slavery is inherent, is in Congo Square. It's really a miraculous sight. Moving on, I'm going to talk about New York and Chicago now. So New York and Chicago are kind of the second homes of jazz. The Great Migration happened, where 6 million African Americans moved from the South to the West, North, and Midwest between 1910 and 1970. This flood caused culture to spread, music to spread, art to spread in general, and it brought it to Chicago and New York, where obviously there was already a prominent scene. Ella Fitzgerald had been doing well, and Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, to name another two, were big names in bebop music, which is another form of jazz. The Man on the Horn continues playing, and I hear Mike Stern's guitar solo. I'm absolutely taken aback. I had no idea this was what jazz was. Granted, this might be jazz rock, but it's still jazz. Now I would like to talk about the impact and evolution of jazz. I have already touched on the people and the places, as well as the roots of jazz. So now let's see how that all ties together and what that has created and how that creation goes on to change itself. Jazz wasn't always loved by the masses. There were times where jazz was frowned upon, jazz was taboo, jazz was not encouraged. And during this time, it was really only enthusiasts and peers of the musicians that were keeping the jazz fire alive. There was, so jazz started with blues and ragtime, which were forms of protest, really, in and of themselves. Where blues was really talking about the melancholy, deep anguish, sorrow, and pain that was felt through slavery and the generations after. And ragtime was almost a message to the white man that you can't keep us down from the black people. So they were both forms of protest that then kind of fused together to form jazz. Jazz evolved into big band and swing music, which then would later become bebop, and there's free jazz that came later as people began to experiment more. So people experimented more and more and more. And as this spread across the globe, it really took over. And there's artists in Norway, Japan, Africa, Russia. Anywhere you go, there's going to be jazz. And it started all here in America. Around the World War II time, the culture of jazz changed. So before World War II, it was a lot of dancing and dance clubs that was happening to jazz music. And after, it was like those smoky nightclubs that you'll see in movies and such. It was a more low-key vibe to it. Jazz has changed a lot. It's taught in schools. There are jazz bands everywhere. And jazz is still alive and well today with many different artists. It's extremely influential in rap and hip-hop, which coincidentally are also black music. There's a trend there. Next slide. To conclude, we've talked about the roots of jazz music. We've talked about the people and places important to jazz music. We've talked about how jazz music has evolved and changed and the impact it has had on American culture. The record is stopped now. No more Miles Davis, just the crackle of an empty vinyl. And I'm left there thinking, what have I just heard? How am I different? Because I knew I was. And I wasn't alone in that. That happened across the country just 100 years ago. I'm officially a part of the collective. Thank you.